honoring Malcolm X, I decided to reread one of his speeches, The Ballot or the Bullet.
Yes.
And when you go through it, I think what's really clear is what Malcolm X is talking about is the urgency of the national struggle, of nationally oppressed peoples to engage in a liberation struggle. And there are three aspects to this that he talks about. He talks about at base, your right to engage in that struggle. He's also very clear in rejecting bourgeois democracy and rejecting protest which supports the rule of the bourgeoisie. So I think the quote that sums it up best is when he says that when we look at other parts of this earth upon which we live, we find that black, brown, red, and yellow people in Africa and Asia are getting their independence. They're not getting it by singing, "We shall overcome." No, they're getting it through nationalism. It is nationalism that brought about the independence of the people in Asia. Every nation in Asia gained its independence through the philosophy of nationalism. Every nation on the African continent that has got its independence brought it about through the philosophy of nationalism. And it will take black nationalism to bring about the freedom of 22 million Afro-Americans here in this country where we have suffered colonialism for the past 400 years. So that's a very clear, straightforward, direct call for national struggle. And, we should ask 54 years later, where are we with national struggle? African-American people, by and large, are confined to internal colonies. There's total political disorganization and alienation, complete economic exploitation. So we haven't advanced in that struggle for a lot of reasons that I'm not going to go into history about that now. But when we look at what Malcolm X is talking about in these liberation struggles that he's drawing inspiration from, we should look at what the differences are if we want to build on our own struggles. And one thing our movements lack right now is really the organizational weapon. So Malcolm X wasn't a Marxist, but the struggles that he's referencing were mostly Marxist-Leninist struggles. And what Marxism-Leninism brought to the struggles in China, Vietnam, and Cuba was a strategy for turning the oppressed masses into a deeply organized political body. It was the democratically organized workers' and peasants' councils which drove and won the struggle for national liberation across the so-called Third World. And without a deeply organized political body, any struggle is doomed to failure. Now, we also know Malcolm X is talking specifically about this kind of a radical struggle. It's not a turn of phrase that he's using. He's not trying to use metaphor to get his point across, because he rules out explicitly forms of bourgeois struggle. And he's really clear about that. In another quote in Ballot or the Bullet, he says, "I'm not a Republican, nor a Democrat, nor an American. I got sense enough to know it. I'm one of the 22 million black victims of the Democrats, one of the 22 million black victims of the Republicans, and one of the 22 million black victims of Americanism." This is important because he's contrasting black identity as being separate from the democratic Republican machine. Like that has it's a relevant revelation because it's like that doesn't have anything to do with our experience. And he's also calling out the fact that black Americans are here because of capitalist oppression. Without slavery, black America as we know it wouldn't exist. And he says in the speech, he's talking to a mostly black audience. He says, some of you think you came here on the Mayflower, but you didn't. We're here because we are human capital, or we were human capital, and that defines our relationship to the government itself, and to the economy, and to everything that has to do with quote-unquote Americanism. And so to identify ourselves as American is to blind ourselves from reality, and it's something that the bourgeoisie wants us to do because they want to blur the distinctions, and they want us to forget our history, and therefore be completely ill-equipped for the struggle. So in Marxist terms, what Malcolm X is actually calling for is to reject right opportunism. He's saying that, if you get involved in the political process, and he goes on, he talks about the Democrats and Republicans as like the fox and the wolf, that these things they always lead to failure, and they're always demoralizing when they do fail. And he also is very explicit and pulls absolutely no punches, even in talking about protests that might in any way reaffirm the rule of the bourgeoisie. So in the last quote that I wanted to bring up, he says, "In 1964, this seems to be the year. Because what can the white man use now to fool us? After he put down that march on Washington, and you see all through that now, he tricked you. Had you marching down to Washington, had you marching back and forth between the feet of a dead man named Lincoln and another dead man named George Washington, singing, 'We shall overcome.' He made a chump out of you. He made a fool out of you. He made you think you were going somewhere, and you end up going nowhere but between Lincoln and Washington." So Malcolm X, aside from kind of smacking you in the head and shaking you out of where you were at, he's also lyrically brilliant, because he's talking about you're between Washington and Lincoln. There's a physical boundary between where you are. And that's exactly what the bourgeoisie does. They create a boundary for acceptable political discussion, and you can't get out of there. So he's created this living, brilliant metaphor. Sorry, I'm just kind of like a word geek. And he's created this brilliant living metaphor to explain this concept that, within the bounds of acceptable discussion, you can sort of say, oh, well, we get to have our opinions and we get to express ourselves. And it seems like the ruling class actually does listen, and they're partially influenced, and sometimes legislation comes out of that. But what you've really done is you've strengthened the bourgeoisie, because you've reaffirmed the fact that when you need to make a change, it should be done in a way that beseeches the ruling class to create the changes that are necessary. And it's disempowering to the oppressed masses, because it's telling us that we can't make that change ourselves. So, what is a meaningful exercise of political expression? It's something that weakens the bourgeoisie and strengthens the nationally oppressed. Transitional demands, for example, which if fulfilled would weaken the ruling class, are one instrument. Outright seizure of economic power is another. And as socialists, we know how to do that. We know how to win democracy. That comes from the organizational weapon. That's what the struggles in Cuba and Vietnam taught us. That instead of accepting bourgeois democracy, which Malcolm X so clearly and surgically points out is false and an illusion, we can have actual workers' democracy and actual people's democracy. So there can be because we understand that there can be no democracy until the people take control of their political lives. There can be no democracy until the people have seized the means of production, until the people have organized themselves into democratic councils which can take hold of their rights and make direct economic seizures against the ruling class. This is what national struggle really looks like, and I think that as Marxist-Leninists, we have a lot to offer in terms of taking Malcolm X's call to national struggle and really bringing it to fulfillment, if we're willing to put in that work. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Monica, she, her. Thanks for attending this special tribute to a great revolutionary, and many thanks to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers for sharing their perspective on a strategic sector of the global working class, the migrant workers. 55 years after his brutal assassination on February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X is still loved and revered here and worldwide, probably more today than when he was alive. But that is usually the case when working class leaders are martyred at such a young age. I want to read some excerpts from the 1965 front page article of Workers' World newspaper, written on February 25th, 1965, 4 days after Malcolm was assassinated. And that article is in this week's Workers' World. And this is a quote. "The bullet that stilled the voice of Brother Malcolm X came from an arsenal of imperialist white supremacy. No matter the hand that pulled the trigger, the missile was guided by the same sinister forces who assassinated Patrice Lumumba and his heroic lieutenants in the Congo." And Lumumba was the first prime minister of the Congo that was elected after the Belgians were kicked out. So we thought, anyway, we had hoped. To continue to quote, "Malcolm was a leader of the oppressed, one who called for self-defense against the violence of the oppressor, and organized the masses with a view to standing up against this violence. Like Lumumba, he had to be removed. The imperialists will let nothing stand in their way in their drive to rule whatever portion of the earth they can. And the time trigger, and they could do this peacefully or democratically, quote unquote, if it ever did exist, is now long past. The depraved, sadistic stooges of the ruling class have been murdering the lesser-known, unsung heroes of the oppressed for centuries. But now the U.S. racist masters have gone in for murdering the leaders. The ruling class has even launched upon a program of government by assassination because its own ranks are torn by the upward thrust of the oppressed peoples. In the case of John F. Kennedy and Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the second UN Secretary General, the assassinations were directed at a so-called moderate wing of the oppressor class. In Malcolm's case, it was directed at a militant wing of the oppressed class, end quote. Now, Netflix produced a 6-part series called Who Killed Malcolm X? How many people have seen that? Okay. It focuses on the forces who not only pulled the triggers that murdered Malcolm at the Audubon Ballroom, but the forces who were behind this execution. Abdur Rahman Muhammad, an historian and investigative reporter, produced this documentary 53 years after the murder of Malcolm. He was questioning why the NYPD and the U.S. government, especially the FBI, did not do a full investigation of the murder unless they played a big role in Malcolm's demise, and even if they didn't pull the trigger. The documentary shows FBI files tracing Malcolm from the time he met the NOI, the Nation of Islam, in 1950 when he was in prison, until he was assassinated in 1965. Once Malcolm broke with the NOI in 1964, the documentary shows Malcolm when he recorded a meeting between himself and FBI agents who came to his home in Queens before it was bombed, asking him to become an informant within the NOI, which of course Malcolm turned down. Out of all the black organizations that the FBI targeted under its helm of its fascistic, notorious director, J. Edgar Hoover, the NOI had compiled more FBI files than any other black organization during that period. Even the civil rights groups led in the movement led by Dr. King to the Black Panther Party. No matter who pulled the trigger, Malcolm's assassination was government-sponsored. Period. End of story. So in winding down my remarks, why does the legacy of Malcolm X still resonate today? His call for the right to self-defense against racist terror is probably the most well-known and best expressed organizationally by the Black Panther Party and the Deacons for Self-Defense and others that were formed after Malcolm's death. But Malcolm was very vocal about police brutality and the racist occupation of the police in the oppressed communities. Muhammad showed footage of Malcolm speaking on the role of the police and contrast that with the Black Lives Matter movement with footage showing the chokehold of Eric Garner, other black people being brutalized, and other Black Lives Matter demonstrations. Whether it was in 1964 or 2014, the state repression of the police is still the same. The second noteworthy point regarding the evolution of Malcolm was his call for unity amongst all black forces, including the more moderate wing of the civil rights movement. And that speech that we saw really, expressed that. While in the NOI, Malcolm was very critical of the nonviolence petty bourgeois stance of the civil rights leaders, like Martin Luther King. That is the turn the other cheek stance when it came to the Bull Connors, the KKK, and other white supremacists, when they unleashed their fascistic terror on the black masses with vicious dogs, bombings, beatings, jailings, and lynchings. Malcolm's political consciousness broadened from revolutionary black nationalism at home to anti-capitalist internationalism with other oppressed peoples based on his travels abroad, especially to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. He once stated, quote, "The same man that was colonizing our people in Kenya was colonizing our people in Congo. The same one in the Congo was colonizing our people in South Africa and in southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and in Burma and in India, and in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. They realized all over the world where the dark man was being oppressed, he was being oppressed by the white man. Where the dark man was being exploited, he was being exploited by the white man," end quote. And this comes from Malcolm X Speaks in 1965. A week before his assassination, he was now talking about the oppression in class terms. Quote, "It is incorrect to classify the revolt of the Negro as simply a racial conflict of black against white, or as purely an American problem. Rather, we are today seeing a global rebellion of the oppressed against the oppressor, the exploited against the exploiter," end quote. Malcolm was making the connections between the struggle against racist oppression at home with racist oppression abroad. He was really talking about imperialism. Malcolm focused on building unity with all black organizations, including those who belonged to the moderate wing of the black struggle. He traveled to Selma and Birmingham to speak to the black masses about the need for unity against the common enemy. He even spoke to Coretta Scott King on the need for this unity while Dr. King was languishing in a Birmingham jail. If Malcolm only championed the rights of black people inside the United States with his nationalist positions, that would be enough right there to respect and applaud him as a working class hero, which our party did. But Malcolm was much more. He was a revolutionary nationalist, developing an anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist perspective. He wanted to take the plight of African peoples globally with a declaration of demands from that the OAAU, which he was talking about in the film, to the United Nations, when it provided more, and this is the United Nations, when it provided more of a forum for oppressed peoples than it does today, due to the national liberation struggles that were still raging during that period. Was Malcolm progressive on all issues, including women, considering the patriarchal positions of the NOI that influenced him for almost a quarter of a century? No, he wasn't. But no revolutionary is perfect, but can only be influenced by the phases of various movements during that time. But just as the Panther leadership evolved when Huey Newton came out in solidarity with the gay movement, which was called during that time, following the Stonewall Rebellion, Malcolm's openness to new thinking could have paved the way for him to evolve on other oppressions, showing that solidarity based on the birth of new working class struggles and movements. Malcolm X had a unique way of speaking to the masses, combining a biting wit, as Makasi talked about, with class truth. His timeless ballot or the bullet speech of almost an hour is well worth listening to. He asked his audience, and I'm paraphrasing how now, this is one of my favorite things that he has ever said. He stated, how can you be violent in fighting the Vietnamese thousands of miles away and not be violent fighting the Klan right here in the Deep South? And he was always he always had you thinking, you know, with this wit, but it was like, you know, light bulbs went off, you know? It really showed those connections between the struggle here and the struggle abroad to show, you know, as Marx said, you know, the ideas of any time are the ideas of the ruling class. And this is why education, both here and in the streets, is so important, you know, to educate our class on these issues. Our party's greatest admiration for Malcolm X is that he ate, slept, and dreamed about global revolution by any means necessary, just as we do, and he will continue to inspire us to help accomplish this goal. Malcolm X Presente.
Good evening, comrades. 55 years ago, Malcolm X was martyred, and he was most assuredly at that time a revolutionary black nationalist. But he was more than that. Not to say that that's not enough. In the last years of his life, he had evolved into an internationalist, you know, and who knows where he was going as a revolutionary if the ruling class had allowed him to live. But like in so many cases, that's not what happens. And so, if I could, I would dedicate the 55th anniversary of his martyrdom to migrant workers. Migrant workers everywhere. Latinx, African, Asian, from the Middle East, Arab, who are suffering on so many levels, and for whom the ruling class is waging a racist war against. We need to stand with migrant workers, not only because there's a terrible war that's been declared on them. We know Trump, but that's big, but it's also elsewhere. Pick a continent. All the people drowning in the Mediterranean, trying to find some salvation somewhere. See? There's another reason why the ruling class is waging war on migrant workers. And I mentioned this, but we shouldn't forget, a lot of migrant workers are from Africa. Every part of Africa are twice removed from the Caribbean, like Haiti and other of the countries in the global South. They want to beat down the migrant workers because they fear them. They fear that migrant workers will become, and indeed are becoming, for lots of reasons. One of them being that they come from countries where there's a tradition of struggle, where they've been celebrating May Day, you know, much longer than we have, at least in the recent epoch. It was migrants who brought May Day back here, if you remember, in 2006. And there is fear in the ruling class that if migrant workers are, first of all, they're in the tens of millions on a global basis. And if they are allowed to organize, to get their act together, they could become a very dangerous for capitalism, a very dangerous revolutionary force in the working class that will push other sections of the working class that may be moving in a comparatively slower level. So there's the war to divide, that's very important, but there's also fear. Somehow I think Malcolm would understand it and much more. The black liberation struggle is complex, depending on time and circumstances. I think that some of you may have heard on TV or read in the newspaper that, well, at least up until recently, that Biden could lose. I'm talking about Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential candidate, you know, trying to win the candidacy, that he's got a firewall in the South because he was Obama's vice president, and a lot of black voters are for him, and up until recently they were showing graphs that showed he was ahead. Well, that's interesting. First of all, it's superfluous. There's more truth under it than explained by it. We have to remember, especially if you come from this part of the United States or the Midwest, which is not to say there aren't similarities in the way that governments, big and small, in every region of the country treat oppressed people. But the South was and still is a very special place. That's apartheid there. See? And when the black struggle won concessions, including the right to vote, there are people who are in their 70s who, when they were born in Alabama, in Mississippi, in North Carolina, they grew up as young adults without having the right to vote. That's something that they can remember and think about their parents and their grandparents, you know. So what happened was that about the mid-60s, 65, 66, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, the white Democrats, particularly the racist leaders in the Democratic Party in the South, which used to be called, some of you will remember this, Dixiecrats. It was the heart of white supremacy. It was a vehicle of oppression and white supremacy. They left the party in droves. And the Democratic Party in the South became primarily a black party, not in terms of the leadership. The leadership was thoroughly bourgeois and not the least bit interested in fighting for oppressed people. But the base of the party, the rank and file of the party, was overwhelmingly, sometimes exclusively black. And those whites who stayed in the Democratic Party in the South were considered to be important allies. You know, actually the dynamic was such, and it's the reason why I'm taking a few seconds to go over it, because it's so distinct from what we have in New York and New Jersey. It's that if you were in the Democratic Party in some of these places in the South, you were considered a socialist or a communist. I mean, that was the culture. It's changed. It's not exactly that way. Racism, consciousness about racism, racist and white supremacist organizing is somewhat more, you know, level around the country, although the South is still important. So you got to understand that about the consciousness of some older black voters. But here's the interesting news. I make reference to Bernie Sanders. I make reference to Bernie Sanders not because we consider him a socialist. We do not. But a lot of people do. And a lot of people are gravitating toward him because they're interested in socialism by the millions. And let me tell you, this is a great thing. This is a breakthrough. This is tremendous. And what? We'll see in a little while. Some more primaries are coming up. What may distinguish Sanders' race in 220 from 216 is that he really wasn't able to make inroads amongst black and brown people, at least to my recollection. You know, there were black figures like Cornel West and others who supported him, but, you know, he didn't have it, and it hurt. But young black and brown people, you know, the sense is that they're excited about Bernie Sanders and socialism. And maybe that's not true, maybe it's half true, but I think in the coming weeks, we're going to see that. And that in and of itself is going to be a tremendous and very interesting development for us to analyze. Again, just like in the Black Lives Matter movement, of which the PPA is a big part of the leadership of it, you see black and brown young people coming to the fore, demonstrating courageous leadership. It's going to happen. And being more political, and being more ideological, and being socialist and communist. There are already many who are like that, but many more are in revolutionary transformation. And I think our party has to get ready for them, you know. I agree with Comrade Makasi and Comrade Vincent, who I think co-wrote the article. The title of it was something like, this decade will be the decade of socialist revolution. I think they're on to something. I believe they're on to something, because there's nowhere to go except revolution, doing away with capitalism, and bringing about something that's humane. I just want to wind up my remarks with touching on something that some of us think about. And, you know, the question of nurturing and helping and supporting black and brown revolutionaries should always be first and foremost on the minds of a revolutionary movement, of a revolutionary party, regardless of where these black and brown revolutionaries come from. Some come from the community. It's very difficult to get arrested, set up, in jail, shot. You know, they come from the workplace, including chicken processing plants, sometimes heavy industry, although there's much less of that, as most of you know, in this country. Some of them come out of prison, like Malcolm. Probably the biggest place where Workers' World newspaper is popular are the prisons in every region of this country. That's a fact. Some of them come off the campus into the Black Lives Matter movement, into the immigrant rights movement. And they're precious. Every revolutionary is precious. Let me say that again. Every revolutionary is precious. But because of white supremacy, black and brown revolutionaries are even more precious. The government, the state, targets them, especially if they are effective or if they appear to show some potential to evolving into effective leaders. They either buy them off, or if they can't buy them off, maybe they kill them or set them up. This goes back to the Black Panthers. It goes back to the NOI. You know, this is how the ruling class deals with potential black and brown revolutionaries. So I think it's time that in our party we begin giving this more thought. Sometimes black and brown revolutionaries come around a party like ours or other parties, and they learn real quick, and yes, I want to learn about Marx and Lenin and, you know, Kwame Nkrumah and, you know, and Che Guevara and everybody, you know, and Salas Shakur. You know, sometimes if the organization is majority white at that particular stage, it can be a little difficult. It can be alienating. And, you know, there's a certain comfort level that they might not feel. What we need to do, especially veteran comrades of color, what we need to do is find the ways to make sure that revolutionaries of color feel comfortable. Sometimes in our party, years ago we used to call it the Third World Caucus. That's out. Now we call it the People of Color Caucus. If we need to put together a People of Color Caucus, then we'll do that, so that the people of color will be able to interact with each other and have discussion groups and have classes, maybe even have a conference where we invite not only people who are members of our organization, but friends and even interested, you know, observers, as long as they're people of color. We've got to think, this may not be all that important. I don't know. I honestly don't know. But what I'm saying on this 55th anniversary of the martyrdom of Malcolm X in Black History Month is that now is the time for revolutionaries to be thinking about how are we going to nurture, educate, defend and protect revolutionaries of color and make it real. Long live Malcolm X.
Again, it all goes back to the issue of solidarity.
Yeah.
It's got to be solidarity. You know, back in, unfortunately, when there was so much repression against the Panthers and the Young Lords and other revolutionary groups, black, especially black and brown, but also AIM too, the American Indian Movement. There was not as much solidarity as there should have been from the broader, you know, left movement in this country. When Jonathan Jackson, you know, tried to free his brother George Jackson from prison in Marin County back in 1970, you know, unfortunately, a lot of left groups called it ultra left, interventionist, and so they didn't get the, you know, instead of really attacking, you know, COINTELPRO and attacking the U.S. government, for really it's a genocidal war against these groups, against these liberation struggles. They just left them hanging. You know, they faced isolation. Except for our party. Our party, we were out in the streets defending the Black Panther Party. We were at the Women's House of Detention defending the Panther women from the Panther 21. You know, Joan Bird and those, you know, demanding their freedom, you know, when they were set up, you know, by the FBI. So there's nothing more important than solidarity. Solidarity is so important for the migrant struggle, any struggle, because the main thing that the ruling class always tries to do is to isolate us, to isolate our struggles. And we have to fight against that isolation, whether it's in the streets or wherever, you know, in the plants, you know, having educational classes, whatever it is. The best education you can get is in the streets, you know, with the people. That's how, you know, that's how you meet people. That's how you meet other, you know, other like-minded people. People, you know, who are fighting for the same things that you're fighting for, or have the potential of doing that. So I would say fighting that isolation is very, very important. And unfortunately, you know, Malcolm faced some of this isolation when he left the NOI. It was very, very unfortunate, but it didn't stop him from trying to build that unity, you know, with other groups. Because Malcolm was evolving. When you talk about the Pan-Africanism, you know, and was he going to, you know, did he have the potential to become a socialist? I think he did. I mean, you can only speculate. But what was really clear was that he was evolving. He was evolving, because you can tell by the language he was using, because at the beginning it was all about, well, the white man, you know, is the enemy, and white man, you know, which, you know, we understand where that's coming from. You know, we would have defended him, you know, even using, you know, those type of terms. But then he started to talk about, well, this is about the oppressed and the oppressor. You know, he started to change, you know, change his language. His language was evolving because, you know, he was seeing the rest of the world. You know, he met Fidel Castro. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to go to Cuba. I bet he would have gone to Cuba to really experience the Cuban Revolution. Now that would have been something if he was allowed to do that before he was assassinated. So just getting this exposure to the rest of the world, to Mecca, his whole world, it seemed to open up when he found other people around the world who, you know, had a common, you know, had common thoughts and common experiences with people right here in this country. Maybe not quite the same, but, you know, facing the same common enemy, as he always talked about. So he was definitely evolving, just like King was evolving too. Dr. King was evolving when he started talking about the Vietnam War and how immoral it was, and he was connecting that war to the war against poor people in this country. The ruling class said, can't have that. He's making those connections. And King was clearly, you know, the most influential, you know, mass leader, you know, in this country at that particular time because of the civil rights movement. So anyway, I think evolution is very important, but it only comes through exposure to the bigger struggles. And there are big struggles going on, globally. And that's why we're part of we say we're part of the global working class. We're not just a working class here, but we're part of a larger global working class that is much bigger than the bourgeoisie. And that's why they are fearful, as what Larry was talking about.
You never know whether the efforts that supporters and other forces in the working class who are not directly under attack, you never know whether what they do can stop or push back a violent, deadly attack on an oppressed people's movement. We don't know if the labor movement, or at least significant sections of it, would have said, no, you can't attack the Black Panthers. No, you can't just shoot them down. You can't just kill Fred Hampton like an animal in his own house, on his bed sleeping, We're going to do something about that. We're going to go on strike. We're going to do something, because it's not just about them, it's about all of us. We don't know. What we do know is that, unfortunately and sadly, usually when oppressed people's movements, especially when they're militant, when they're defending their right to defend themselves, but even when they're not, when those of us who consider ourselves progressive or revolutionaries are part of the working class movement. I'm a Marxist, I'm a socialist, so I look at things in terms of class. When we allow the government, the ruling class, the state, the FBI, the police, the army, SWAT, to just ICE, to just do what they want to do to oppress people, and we show no interest, well, you don't have to speculate about the outcome. It's going to be bad. And there were big differences in the movement over whether or not to defend the Black Panthers. I'm not saying this to polemicize against anybody, but some organizations even call the Black Panther and Malcolm X fascists, because they were black nationalists. We think this reflects a horrible position on the black question in this country and the national question. And they use it as an excuse. You want to kill Malcolm, you want to kill Huey, Erica, whatever, go ahead. We got other things to do, There's some exceptions, thank goodness. But unfortunately, they are just exceptions. There's a very sad, tragic legacy of the working class movement, labor unions, not standing up and taking strong positions. Now it's the question of who will defend the migrant workers. We need more forces, both inside and outside the official labor movement. We need them inside the labor movement to be telling them, why aren't you defending these workers? How could you possibly let ICE raid 20 factories in the South? Those are your workers there. Many of the places we unionize. How could you do that? That's an attack on you. You let them come there to get migrant workers. Tomorrow they'll come and get you regardless of your status. This should have been automatic. How can you do that? You should have called demonstrations all over the place. You should have raised holy hell. Oh no, we can't do that because some of our workers don't understand, and there's a lot of anti-immigrant stuff, and they're taken in by it, and some of them even think that immigrants are taking our job, and blah blah blah. So we don't want to push them, and whatever. Some of them voted for Trump. It's just a bunch of excuses for not doing anything. So we just have to be stronger about it. Solidarity, and I'm a revolutionary optimist. The road is long and full of hills and valleys, but we have no choice. Solidarity cannot stay a nice thought and a good word in a speech. If we're going to unite our class on a global basis, solidarity more and more has to have teeth in it. It has to come with bodies. It has to be real. It means when these people are on strike, we do something. You know, even if they're in another continent and speak another language and have another culture, the world's very small. It don't matter. See, that's what revolutionary internationalism is. But don't despair. Understand what has happened and why it's been weak. But it can be strengthened. It really can. It will take hard work and revolutionary politics. And I hope that, you know, those of you who can will join us. You know, it's the same thing that the sister asked about, you know, what can a white person do? You know, a lot of ways of looking at that. You know, I don't know if you're looking at it from this point of view, but, you know, I know there are some whites, and this is not a bad thing, you know, who are at least at a level of consciousness where they know that they are treated differently by the police, that they are less likely to be arrested and beaten up and shot, you know, that in many ways, even if they're poor, you know, life is going to be easier because they don't have to walk around with black and brown skin, which is a target, you know, and they want to do something. How can I equalize that, you know, whatever. And that's good, but that has to evolve, in my view, in the view of our party, to where it's not just, you know, white people feeling guilty. You know, I personally think that guilt doesn't amount to much. You know why? You get tired of it, and then you betray your friends. You know, you have to have an interest in solidarity. If you believe in the class being united, you know, that's beyond guilt. I'm supporting Black Lives Matter. I'm supporting the migrant workers. I'm supporting the Palestinians. I'm supporting Native people because I know I must do that so that our class will be united, and ultimately, somewhere along the line, it will benefit me. And even if I'm martyred, it will benefit somebody. You know, and it's not just about guilt.